It's a beautiful Saturday morning, and you're welcome to another intriguing episode of China Now, the only show tailored to bringing you the latest updates from China and beyond. My name is Makiza Latifa, and I am absolutely thrilled about today's lineup. We're kicking off the show with a Thinkers Forum, which promises to be especially engaging this week with a three-part discussion. Our first speaker is none other than Charles Freeman Jr., former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense. He'll be diving into global politics, focusing on the complex dynamics between China, Taiwan, and the United States. Stay tuned because you won't want to miss what he has to say.
I think it can. That depends in large measure on us, the United States, because we seem to be insisting on continued primacy in Pacific Asia rather than sharing the space, as I think we should, with China. China does not have active patrols off our coasts. It does not have bases near us, military bases. We are, on the other hand, we have such things vis-a-vis China. So I think there's an imbalance, and I think we need to correct that. I think the issue for the US government and our political system, that is a very simple one. In World War II, prior to World War II, we were not much involved in the world. We were isolationists. We were very late to join World War II. We did not join it until Japan attacked us at Pearl Harbor. In the course of World War II, we became the global hegemon, in effect. The Soviet Union should have most credit for defeating the Nazis. We defeated the Japanese in the Pacific. The Japanese Empire had overthrown the British, French, and Dutch empires and the American Empire in the Philippines in Pacific Asia. And when we overthrew the Japanese Empire, we created a vacuum and we filled it. And we imagine that there's still a vacuum, but there isn't. Japan is back as a great economic power, a global power. Vietnam has shown that it can defend itself against anyone. Countries like Thailand are independent, and Indonesia is rising. There is no vacuum, but we still want to exercise primacy. We have been accustomed to being in charge. It's hard to give up your status as the boss. So I think this is our problem, that we are not adjusting to two facts. One is we are not necessary anymore. There can be a constructive relationship, including some measure of a balance of power in Pacific Asia. We will participate in this, but we don't have to be on the front line. And second, we really should remember that our position in Asia is 79 years old. We should be willing to return to earlier days when we did not try to control events in the region. We participated, we took part, we played a role, but it was a more modest role. I think we don't understand correctly the position of China in the region before the arrival of the West and imperialism. People talk about the tribute system. I think this was actually state trade. It was mutual bribery, if you will, and China trying to ensure that nobody outside China thought about invading it. And so I think we imagine China in terms of European analogies that don't work. China is not Germany. It does not look for Lebensraum, for expanded space to settle. I don't think Chinese want more Koreans or Vietnamese or any other people on their territory. And China is within a natural geographic area bounded by seas, by mountains, by oceans, by deserts, in which Chinese culture is confined, essentially. So, and it has expanded slowly over millennia. It has absorbed people. And many people who now call themselves Han have other origins in the past. So I think we don't understand this very well. We think of Germany, we think of Japan, bursting out of its isolation. We think of France and Napoleon, and we think of the Russians and their expansion across Eurasia. I don't think China fits these patterns. So I would argue that we are hostile to a China that we imagine that does not actually exist. I was involved in the very earliest opening to China. The way Henry Kissinger conducted his discussions with Zhou Enlai, he began by asking, how do you see this issue? What do you think is happening? Will what happens if you do nothing, will what happens be to your advantage or against you? Is there a way that you could make it, if it is going to be against you, is there a way you could improve it and make it for you? Then he would explain how we see things, and he would ask, if we cannot cooperate directly, can we each separately, in parallel, take action to try to make things turn out better for both of us? So this began with a kind of philosophical or strategic review, intelligence review of the world situation. And it assumed that the other side had valuable views and capabilities that it could put to bear on the issue that would advantage us. We have not had that sort of dialogue for decades. People go to Beijing and they say, you are wrong about this, and you must do this and do that, and so forth. And, whether it's the Taiwan question or it's sanctions or technology battle, this is not a productive way to conduct a bilateral relationship between China and the United States. The Taiwan issue, which is an issue left over from history, from the Chinese Civil War, which did not conclude because the defeated Republic of China retreated to Taiwan, and the Korean War broke out and the United States intervened, and that grew into the current situation. Taiwan has evolved very differently from the mainland. It has a Japanese heritage. It has a Kuomintang heritage. So it's a very complex thing. I think Chinese are capable of sitting down with each other and bridging the gaps that this different history has created. And I think the United States bears some responsibility. I think the Trump administration is going to be a little more sophisticated about this than Mr. Biden was. I don't sense that Mr. Trump has any desire to go to war with China over Taiwan. Even Marco Rubio, who is the new Secretary of State in waiting, is ambivalent about this question. It may be the best thing that could happen is that everybody decides that a war is not a good idea. And the only predictable response of a war would be the destruction of Taiwan's prosperity. So I think, I hope we can find a way to set aside thoughts of war, and that people in Taiwan will realize that they cannot enjoy security or prosperity if they do not have an agreeable relationship with Chinese across the strait. I hope in this area too, Taipei and Beijing, who are the keys to this, not the United States, will find a way to resume dialogue and find a consensus.
Well, let's continue the show with the second part of the Thinkers Forum, featuring Richard Sakwa, a distinguished British political scientist and honorary professor at the Faculty of Political Science at Moscow State University. In this segment, Professor Sakwa will delve into four interconnected issues: the concept of hegemony, the dynamics of multipolarity, the idea of a Cold War, and the cultures that have emerged from these periods of global tension. Stay with us as we unpack these fascinating topics in detail.
I'm going to try to deal with four connected issues. The first one is hegemony, the notion of hegemony. The second is multipolarity. The third is the concept of Cold War. and the fourth is the actual culture or cultures of Cold War. And so in a few minutes I want to tie these concepts together. The first one, hegemony. Now, hegemony has a long, long history. I know that there's a huge debate in China, for example, and there has been all the way even before the warring states time about the notion of leadership, dominance, and ultimately the character of power. So this is a debate which has been not just an Anglo-Saxon debate, and it's huge in the Anglo-Saxon international studies literature, and not just in Western discussion, the Peloponnesian War, which of course was very important about Athens and Sparta, but of course other cultures, China, and of course the Indian culture. So in other words, the way we look at hegemony needs to be widened from our Anglo-Saxon or Eurocentric perspective. And it's ultimately, and for our purposes today, the fundamental issue is hegemony the same or equivalent to empire? What is the nature of leadership in that system? And obviously, my focus is that system established in and after 1945. Is this dominant political order or formation of our times, which I call the political West. It's important to identify the subject of the major processes in international politics today. This is more precise, in my view, the notion of a political West than the term, for example, the collective West, which Moscow is very keen to use, and others who talk about liberal hegemony, which is far too vague in my view, or Eichenberg's talk about a liberal international order. When we identify this political West, we're talking about a political formation that was established and shaped by the Cold War. And in that context, the Cold War itself, but this is something which was established beginning in 1945, when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was both the last act of the old world, if you like, and the first act of this new world of permanent Cold War in which we now live. And so that moment, the 1945 moment, is fundamentally important. And so this political West, is this Atlantic power system, if you like it, is a world order in contemporary jargon, which up until between 1945 and 1989, it had an opposition. It had the Soviet Union as an alternative model of world order. After 1989 or 91, the Soviet Union obviously disappeared. The second world, if you like, disappeared, the Soviet Union, and as the Chinese would have added to that, the European dimension also was marginalized, and some people call it vassalized within this Atlantic power system, within this US-led political West. After 1989, this political West, which was shaped by Cold War, and during which we saw in the United States the transformation of the American political state. That, there's a large literature about this, and if you remember that communist Eisenhower, in his farewell address, condemned the military-industrial complex.
A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment.
We saw the emergence of what Michael Glennon calls the Trumanite state, a national security state, which dominates to this day. Ben Rhodes calls it the blob. John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt, endless number have talked about how the US state has changed or transformed as a result of the Cold War, and the foreign policy today is dominated by the Uni Party, the liberal interventionists on the Democratic side, the neocons on the Republican side, but ultimately having a bipartisan foreign policy, which is indistinguishable one from the other, but an enormous element of continuity. After 1989, this uni-state, if you like, this Trumanite military security, ideological propaganda state, media, academic, all hugely involved in it, radicalized. But it's fundamentally, even this transformation of the US state went global. And so it wasn't just globalization of the sort which Radhika has just discussed, but it universalized, which is a different concept. Before 1989, hardly anyone even used the word globalization. And then afterwards it became, universalism. That was the geo-economic side of things. The universalism was the political side of it. And there were 5 radicalizations going on. The Hegelian, this was the end of history, that there is no viable or legitimate alternative to Western modernity, to Western civilization. The second one is the Kantian, Immanuel Kant's radicalization, the elevation of human rights, as Samuel Moyn calls it, the final utopia, forgetting social economic development, social equality, inclusive societies in the sense of economic inclusion, instead of which you see the marginalization of trade unions, you see the marginalization of collective bargaining, collective devalorization of labor itself. The dignity of labor is reduced. And so human rights as an abstract takes the place, and of course accompanied by the vision of perpetual peace, which of course takes the form of perpetual war. Which takes us the third radicalization, Hobbesian, the war of all against all. This is a vision of international politics which is always about win-lose. It's about dominance, hegemony. It's about, some people could call it imperialism. It's this vision, this Hobbesian struggle, this vision of the world as a Hobbesian, endless element. Of course, Thomas Hobbes was writing under the impression of the English Civil War, and it was a war of all against all, and therefore you needed this hegemon, this Leviathan, dominant over it. And the Leviathan, of course, is the political West. The vision that without this political West, without the Washington-led West, the whole world would descend into disorder. Of course, it generates disorder itself by seeing the world in that way. So this Hobbesian radicalization. The fourth radicalization, let's call it Hayekian, you could call it the Milton Friedmanite, the vision of neoliberalism, which replaced that dominant paradigm of the New Deal in the United States, social democracy in Western Europe.
I pledge myself to a New Deal for the American people.
But that paradigm which gave way in the late 1970s and dominates to this day, which is a rampant market states where the state has hollowed out the developmental, not just economic development, but even the societal and human development gives way to market relations. And Milton Friedman, of course, is the apostle of that vision. And of course, it is imposed by force. Naomi Klein, of whom I'm enormous in admiration of her, already 20 years ago in her book, The Shock Doctrine, talks about this in huge detail and marvelous detail, but many, many others, of course, have talked about this. So this is the fourth one, the Hegelian or Hayekian. The fifth one is based and developed on the vision of Leo Strauss, the Straussian vision. Now, Leo Strauss, as you know, is the father of neoconservatism, but neoconservatism isn't just an ideology. It's a way of conducting public life. It hollows out the public sphere. Straussianism is ahistoricism taken to the extreme. In other words, for a Straussian, Plato is a universal. From my view, I'm a great Platonist myself, but the vision of Plato is that his truths, which are only known to a select few in his division between exogenous and endogenous truths, is that it is only a select few know what should be done, these apostles of development, and everybody else is not just mistaken, but they're also evil if they don't understand this. And the thing about Straussians is that they do not engage in debate. We have been vouchsafed the truth. We in Washington know what's what. And you who fight against it are not just mistaken. You guys are evil because you don't understand this, our ability to interpret it, the prophet, as it were, which can interpret it. Well, Straussianism is a very rich terrain to understand the deeper culture of this political West. So all this shapes, as I say, these five things. It's a sort of Straussian ahistorical hermeneutics, way of understanding the world, which about understanding even knowledge. And it destroys the public sphere of debate. And of course, in a contradiction then emerges and it cannot be agonized. So very briefly, my second theme is precisely this multipolarity. We've touched about this. Now, multipolarity is, basically, it's an ideology. It's an ideology which basically says, we do not need hegemony. I mean, the way it's used today. I mean, there's a whole literature in the US the way they use it, but I'm using it this way. It's after hegemony. We don't need that leadership that vouchsafed to the political West to impose order, to its vision of modernity, its vision of human relations in all depth. We don't need that. And it's therefore, it's an ideology, but I mean in the best sense of the term, an ideational framework. And of course, it was explicitly so when it was the modern form was first introduced by Yevgeny Primakov in 1996, the former Russian foreign minister, and he's developed it. And even I remember his first article in a newspaper, Nezavisima Gazeta, in 1996. And it led to a huge reaction by the liberals in Russia itself and in the West, because it was a challenge to precisely the dominance of this vision which I've just outlined, this hegemonic vision of post-Cold War, post-communist world order. And it was therefore, there's many elements to this ideology, the normative, which we've touched on, but just to stress one aspect of multipolarity, a very substantive one, and that is that it is based precisely on the United Nations, this charter international system, this vision of sovereign internationalism. That is the ideology of the United Nations. Today there's 193 states in the United Nations. Through this charter international system, we had decolonization. We had this charter system, with all of its flaws, has provided a vision of Westphalia plus. It's not just Westphalia, which is the emergence of states, like billiard balls bashing against each other, that Hobbesian vision of win-lose. It's actually the vision of the Charter, the UN Charter of 1945, is of, yes, sovereign states, but sovereign engaging in quite a thick multilateralism within the framework of the Charter. So it's internationalism as well. So whereas Westphalia doesn't have that dimension. So when this whole stack of US political scientists say, oh, you in China, you in Russia, you in wherever, simply in multilateralism, all you're talking about is returning to a Westphalian system. I'm arguing precisely not that. It's Westphalia, yes, plus states, sovereign states, devising their own developmental paths and paths to modernity, but within this international framework and within a very thick normative framework established by the common endeavor of the United Nations. Don't forget, the Soviet Union was a founder member. China signed the UN Declaration of January 1942. China was very much a part of it. India joined as a founder member, even though it was still a colony in 1945. So this charter system today, and this is by the by, to say that this United Nations Charter international system is under unprecedented challenge now. The Ukrainians say, throw it out. Israel says, throw it out. Those, and in the United States, have always been ambivalent about it. Anyway, so this is the charter system is counter-hegemonic by its very essence. And then, of course, you have, multilateralism is a materialist. We talked about this as well before. The economic power is shifting from the Atlantic to the Pacific and many things. So there's a material basis to it. It's happening. And so on. And then there's structural. We talk about BRICS. We talk about other emerging political East. So by the bipolar system of the Cold War I, the first Cold War, has now changed. So there is a nascent political East emerging. And one thing I want to stress here, it is not simply, this political East includes the Eurasian powers plus certain swing states from the global South. That this isn't simply anti-hegemonic, i.e. opposing the political West, and it is counter-hegemonic. It is repudiating the logic of the political West, the logic of Cold War, the logic of lose-win, the logic of bloc politics, the logic of endless militarism, and so on. So it is not, so Joseph de Maistre says, it's not counter-revolution, it's anti-hegemony. And this is at the very heart of the Russo-Chinese joint statement of February 2022, and of course the second joint statement, which also confusingly signed just recently when Putin visited Beijing, and so many other states. It's also in all the documents of the BRICS plus today, the 10 members plus 30 odd who want to join it. It's also in all the documents of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's in the documents of the Brazil-China peace plan for Ukraine and so on. In other words, this, and I stress this again, it is counter-hegemonic, counter-imperialist, counter the dominance of a single vision of modernity and so on. So I stress it is, in that sense, of course, it is not anti-Western, it is post-Western. It is not anti-American, it is post-American. We work with many in the United States, we work with many in the West. We are even part of that. So this is my third point, just briefly, is about Cold War itself. And it's important. I mean, people keep saying, hey, why do you go on and on about Cold War? Well, I know the Chinese are very ambivalent about the notion of Cold War. I've been to Beijing, I was there in March and earlier, and I've often been condemned for talking about it. And the Chinese, why do you talk about Cold War? It's over, guys. We're moving into win-win and so on. Lovely, marvelous. I love these development, all these Chinese initiatives. They're marvelous documents, marvelous. The reason why I say that is because, and of course, even in China, why the Chinese don't like it is because it puts them in a similar position to the Soviet Union earlier. And of course, I certainly don't mean that. It's very different. And of course, the second Cold War is very different from the first. Yet, my point is, there is a certain character of politics which is a Cold War style of politics. And this is what's condemned by all the Chinese documents, all the BRICS and Shanghai and all these counter-hegemonic documents, is that it's a style of politics in the nuclear age. That's why I mentioned Hiroshima and Nagasaki earlier. The problem is, and in the Cold War, it isn't just that we have separate interests, which is normal in a sovereign internationalism. It's endless, and you mediate it through negotiations, through diplomacy. That's what de Derian in his great work on diplomacy, precisely said. Diplomacy works when precisely to deal with states which are competing in a healthy, normal manner. Whereas in a Cold War, by definition, it's different. The problem is not that you have different interests for us, it is that you exist, that you are challenging the very existential basis of politics. I mean, I could go on in my other notes a lot about this. It is a struggle, in other words, for hegemony. It is empire versus the rest, in which the hegemon claims to represent the interests of a broader community, that universalism which I talked about especially after 1989. But it has been a permanent Cold War. My argument is there's been a permanent Cold War since 1945. In the first phase, Cold War I, 1945 to 1989, a cold peace, which was Cold War by other means between 1989 and 2014, and then the second Cold War in which we are today, which takes place in the foothills of the Third World War, and it's much more dangerous than that. So very briefly, my fourth and final, and I was trying to stress the cultures of this Cold War. There's a hegemonic one, which includes, I'll just list it, militarism, which includes bloc politics, collective defense and not collective security, hermeticism from Leo Strauss. This is the hyper-normalization of a particular vision of the world, which denormalizes everything else. We're hyper-normal, the US-led West. Our truth is the only truth, and you are abnormal and denormalization. Anti-diplomacy, very powerful. That this is even in the first Cold War, they didn't dismantle the institutions of diplomacy, endless expulsions of people. The ideology of democratism, which stands above democracy itself. We know what your result should be, and if you don't get it, we must have a regime change and change it to democratism. The crisis of hegemony as well, within all of that. But I wanted to stress the cultures, and my final point is that there is a counter-hegemonic culture emerging as well. And my key point in all of this is that any counter-hegemonic formation, Russia, China, whatever, it needs to be more than just simply replicating the logic of Cold War hostility, win-lose, and so on. It needs to transcend it, both in its internal and external dimensions. So in other words, it is the biggest challenge for the political East, is to transcend and to become better than that political West which it has challenging, and not simply to replicate it. And too often, it regresses into nativism, into parochialism, in this idea of a civilization state, which is important. But at the same time, that vision runs the danger of going back into, how can I put it, a less... the challenge today is to devise within this counter-hegemonic formation a progressive vision of development, of peace, to utilize the huge technological and potential and biological, medical and other developments of humanity, not for the cause an endless Cold War, but for dialogue and peace and development. And that is the challenge which I think we face today. Thank you.
And wrapping up today's edition of the show is Kishore Mahbubani, a renowned Singaporean diplomat and thought leader. With his deep insights and global perspective, he'll be sharing his views on China's evolving role in the international order and what it means for the rest of the world. So stay tuned for an enlightening conversation to conclude this episode of China Now.
From your experiences dealing with Americans, do the American political establishment really have a correct, thorough understanding of China's politics? Do the Chinese political establishment have a correct understanding of US politics so that both countries can find ways to coexist, at least peacefully, not going into a hot war? I'll start with Kishore.
Well, let me answer the question about whether or not the American establishment has a good understanding of China, and the simple answer is no. There is a tremendous amount of ignorance. And actually, one man who privately confirmed this to me was then America's greatest living strategic thinker, Henry Kissinger. I had a conversation with him one-on-one in October 2022, I guess about a year before he died. And we were discussing US-China relations. As you know, he's the one who gave me the insight on which I built my book, Has China Won? That the US has launched a geopolitical contest against China, but it hasn't worked out a comprehensive long-term strategy. And why hasn't it worked out a comprehensive long-term strategy? Because it doesn't understand China. It doesn't realize that actually China is a much more formidable competitor than anything that the United States has experienced. And the big problem in the United States is that opinion is often made, especially in the East Coast, by the liberal pundits. And the liberal pundits just assume that because China is run by a Chinese Communist Party And the liberal pundits believe that all communist parties will eventually fail. And therefore the Chinese Communist Party will fail and the United States will win. I mean, this is an incredibly naive belief, but that's what they all believe, shockingly. And they haven't tried to understand the reality of China. And so when the US Congress set up a committee on the strategic competition between the United States and China, there's no doubt there's a strategic competition between the United States and China. What do they name the committee? They said, this is a committee on the strategic competition between the United States of America and the Chinese Communist Party. And I told them, this is not a contest between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. This is a contest between the United States and Chinese civilization, which has only been around 4,000 years. So do you understand the nature of the contest you're engaged in? And the honest answer is they don't, which is sad. And this is puzzling because in theory, America is an open society. But I say the paradox about American society is that when it comes to China, the United States is an open society with a closed mind.
Do you think the Chinese leadership gets the Americans?
Well, I would say this. If the Chinese leadership is not feeling confused about the state of American politics, then there's something wrong with the Chinese leadership. They should be confused. Because all of us are confused, right? There's something about American politics which has always been unpredictable. That's a reality. Because the American system is so open domestically, nobody can predict outcomes. But at the same time, what we have today in the United States is, even by American standards, an unprecedented level of unpredictability. And therefore, it would be natural for the Chinese leadership to be confused by the United States of America.
Two very good questions. I would say in relative comparative studies, I would say perhaps the Chinese on the whole understand the West, including the United States, 10 times better than the West knows about China. For one thing, we have more than 3 million students who have studied or are still studying in the West. 85% have returned home. And they know foreign languages, know Western cultures, and know realities. And more specifically, if you look at say at this particular moment, these key foreign policy decision makers like Blinken or Sullivan, etc., you look at their educational background. They were the generation of winning the Cold War, and they were trained in the American-style political science. I did my study in Geneva University. At that time, we were debating whether we should have a political science or political studies, and 50-50. When you emphasize political studies, you are thinking of this particular field, not science yet. We have to lay a lot of emphasis on history, on philosophy. But the United States, the post-Cold War education in international relations, in political science, is essentially no doubt about this end of history. Western liberal democracy has won, so it's very ideological. So what remains is mathematics, models, As a result, they misread China, misread Southeast Asia, misread outside the world, and misread the United States. Sometimes we say it's a pseudoscience, not a real science. So on this background, I would say perhaps China and Chinese leaders know the West better, the United States better. Another important thing is our education in international relations, in political science, strongly influenced by the United States. Yet, the overall philosophy for China's rise and reform and opening up is what we call the seeking truth from facts, 实事求是. So that has helped China to avoid a lot of mistakes. Whatever the theory, we do not believe in dogmas. We believe in checking facts. So we find that Soviet model not working very well, American model not working very well. We start to explore our own model. So I'm slightly optimistic on the Chinese side.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of China Now. I hope you enjoyed watching and found our discussions insightful. Don't forget to share your comments, thoughts, feedback, and suggestions through the email provided below. Would love to hear from you. Once again, my name is Makiza Latifa, and I'll see you at the same time next week. Enjoy the rest of our programming and have a wonderful day.